Stella Nair, you are Associate Professor of Indigenous Arts of the Americas at UCLA. Thank you for accepting this second invitation of the Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies to reflect on the extraordinary year 2020 that is now behind us. Behind us is a calendar year, even if its effects are still with us. This podcast interview is part of our OPED and podcast series on the intersections between current events and our research or the state of our fields. And in my recent podcast interview with Wendy Teeter, Senior Curator at Fowler Museum, we talked about the history of narratives of fantastical or otherworldly origins in order to explain the stature or the advances of Indigenous peoples. So, for example, on Catalina Island, it was considered to be the refuge of biblical giants. Another story mentioned was about the alien races of South America. They would have been levers of civilization, so to speak. Now, the present moment has fostered all kinds of truth claims seeking legitimacy in the distant past. So this was the reason to renew CMRS's invitation to speak with you to find out more about the stories and conspiracy theories surrounding the alien races in Peru. If you could give us a few examples of these kinds of theories or stories, that we would be very grateful.
Well, thanks for inviting me. It's good to be back talking about the Andes. I'd say right now there's a lot of stories about aliens building a lot of things that Indigenous people see as the products of their own innovations. And they probably two of the most popular are associated with the Incas. When people see that fabulous stonework, immediately they assume that Native people didn't do it and that aliens must have come down. There's a lot of different descriptions of who the aliens were. Often they're described as 12 feet tall, white, and having beards. Another popular alien story that you hear by people who visit Peru are for the Nazca Lines. When people see these, they often go up in a plane to see them. And the idea is, well, then they must have been built in order for people from up in the sky to see, and therefore aliens must have come down and built those as well. So both of those are very popular, particularly among tourists who come to the Andes.
Thank you, Stella. Now, these stories, because they have to do with aliens, right? They are actually dealing with a deep past, a past so deep that it almost sounds like it's atemporal or eternal, because it would surpass the simple human temporality. And yet at the same time, it is a past that sounds very futuristic, right? So it's also about, in a sense, projecting onto the future. So somewhere between the deep past and a distant future. But these narratives do have a past, and they do have this deep past. And so I wanted to ask you to delve into the history of these stories, these alien stories. Maybe when do they first emerge, with what agendas, to what extent they actually might depend on the colonial perspective. These are some of the questions that these stories make me wonder about.
Well, I think we can see their roots very much, or very clearly, when Europeans first arrived in the Americas. And there's a lot of confusion by people in Europe when they realize there's a whole chunk of the globe that they didn't know about, and to try and explain where this huge mass of land came from and who these people were. And a lot of stories emerge about the history of the Indigenous people of the Americas. A lot of this is based in trying to put this in a biblical narrative, finding spaces in which Indigenous people could have been mentioned. But one of the problems of trying to explain this is either they're seen as children of paradise, and so perpetually, in a sense, still childlike, or they are perhaps related to the devil. And neither of these narratives then, of course, are going to explain magnificent cities that were across the Americas. And so this became a big problem, trying to explain the magnificent urban centers of places like Tenochtitlan, of Cusco, the remains of the major urban center of Teotihuacan, Cahokia, one of the largest cities, top 20 cities in the world in the medieval period. How could either of these paradigms of Indigenous people and Indigenous history have created that? And so that's where we see these stories being invented, that it must have been wandering Europeans, whether it's Vikings or Welshmen, who built these cities, and then what happened to them. And so there's lots of discourse about who could have built them. Anybody but Indigenous people, because again, it's this colonial agenda of diminishing Indigenous accomplishments and Indigenous history. And the people who replace, who are doing these innovations, change across the centuries, but the paradigm is still there. And so the one of the 20th and 21st century is of aliens. We see this with Eric von Daniken. His writings, fictional writings, start getting put onto the Nazca Lines. Even though we have Indigenous stories, Indigenous narratives, we have the material culture that shows how the Incas built their magnificent buildings, and it's just brilliant innovation with very simple tools. It just shows like the creativity of people to build and to create, that people will still prefer to believe, non-Indigenous people will still prefer to believe that it's some aliens that built Inca architecture or instructed them how to build it. And same with the Nazca Lines. We have a very clear understanding how those were built. Some were visible, some weren't. But a big thing that they don't understand is that you can't project European ways of understanding art onto other cultures. There's a long tradition in the Americas of creating art that is not meant to be seen, that it is usually made as an offering to sacred forces, that the lack of visibility of humans is part of the gift of it. So always assuming that, well, you have to make something so somebody can see it, flies in the face of, Aztec sculpture, has sculpture actually on the bottom that was meant for the earth to see. So it's a colonial way of thinking over the centuries that continues to deny that Indigenous people have the ability to come up with brilliant design, innovative construction, and they can do these things with, limited tools that we tourists in particular have a problem accepting.
Thank you, Stella. What you showed us with these stories is really that the alien races, or the alien story, is kind of the beginning and the end point. And in a sense, no matter how long the history of Indigenous peoples is, it is always, in a sense, enveloped within this umbrella narrative and the umbrella history so long that it precedes, and so long that it would ostensibly go beyond any human history. And I just wanted to ask you, this being encompassed, being enveloped within the history of this alien race, what are some of the damaging effects of such narratives and such theories for the Indigenous peoples?
Well, thanks for asking that. And I think that goes right to the heart of why this is such an important issue. A lot of people think of this as, oh, it's just fun. Like, it's just my ideas of the past. Why should anyone care? But it's not benign at all. In fact, it's very toxic. And it's part of this legacy of denying Indigenous people rights to this land and to the great monuments that their ancestors built on it. We see this in the beginning of the colonial period, where there's arguments that Indigenous people had migrated here very, very recently, and that this has moved into scholarship. And only recently, when excavations have been and dating techniques have improved, that it's like, oh no, people here much, much longer than people suspected. But there's a 500-year legacy of trying to say that Indigenous people weren't in these lands very long, and didn't create these magnificent cities and buildings that we see surviving today. And it's a huge problem because it isn't something of the past. There's stories from across the Americas every year of Indigenous people whose land is seized by the state or by private entities, much less Indigenous people whose land was taken illegally, the fights that they go through to try and get their lands back. And that all this goes down to, well, what is the history of this place? And so by moving in this alien narrative and saying like, yeah, actually it was aliens who built this, not the Indigenous people, is another way of saying that this land and these monuments don't belong to the history and the people of the Indigenous Americas.
Thank you, STELLA and NAIR, for spending time with us again. Thank you for, in such a concise and lucid way, showing us what unsubstantiated or fantastical narratives can do and do as damage to our common life on Earth. I can only thank you again for sharing your knowledge and for spending time with us. And I hope that our viewers will continue watching this series in the upcoming podcasts. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.